All right, we're live. Excellent, thank you. So maybe I will go ahead and start with you. So Anna Westerby, geneticist from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And just to offer us some perspective on what you think the contribution of perennial crops might be to agriculture in Sweden.
Yeah, from a Swedish perspective, I think they can offer many important things to Swedish agriculture. I mean, one of the challenges also for the Swedish farmer is the fluctuations in extreme weather and extreme periods of drought and even waterlogging. Which I mean, we were reminded last summer that this is actually something that we have to consider also in the future, even for the food industry. So I think that the perennial plants can be very important to increase food security. And I'm also thinking about that they can offer a diversity of crops, which I think is extremely important, especially for the northern part of Sweden, where if you're thinking about cereals, it's mainly spring barley you can grow there. So that's one thing, or another thing. And also, if it will be possible also to make it, to use them as multi-purpose crops, I think that could offer the farmers, I mean, they can choose, actually, they will get more alternatives. I mean, if we can use them not only as a fodder crop or a grain crop for human consumption, maybe also as a catch crop or a cover, I don't know, crop. I think that would also be important for the Swedish agriculture. And of course, we also have this global perspective that it's a, what could we say, that could be a tool to reduce I mean, the agriculture also have to take the responsibility of reducing our environmental impact. And I'm 100% sure that the perennial crops can help out with that.
And then sitting right next to you, Richard Hayes, coming to us all the way from Australia, agronomist from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. How do you see perennial crops contributing in the Australian context?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in some respects the challenges for us are a little bit less than in other parts of the world. Perennials have been a big part of our mixed grazing cropping systems for a long time, and so it's not such a jump for us to move from a perennial forage to a sort of, as Lee was describing before, to a perennial grain crop. And so I mean, I see the opportunities for us is not simply replacing an existing system, but actually just adding to an existing system by giving farmers who already use some perennial species, forage species at the moment, but potentially giving them the option to increase their versatility and at least in some years harvest grain. So I mean, I think that the opportunities are very great for us.
And then on my end of the panel here, Damian Ravetta, plant physiological ecologist from the University of Patagonia and National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina. How about in your part of the world? What's the role for perennial crops?
I see something in between what Richard was saying and what Lee commented before. I think that on the production side, farmers may be willing to take the perennial crops. And in fact, there are several farmers working with us just because they want to do it, they realize that they want to do it. What I see a problem in Argentina is the industrial side. The industry, because of the economic waves and uncertainties, is less willing to get into new options and new commercialization options. So unless the production is very similar and goes into international markets, it's a little more difficult to get that part. What Lee and Richard were saying about the first alternatives, like going into grazing before, may be a good option to introduce the crops, but again, the commercialization, if we end up producing grain may be harder and more difficult.
And then on the opposite end of the panel, Eric Manyasa, who's coming to us from the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in Kenya. Why are you interested in perennial crops, and what contribution do you think they might make in farming systems in your part of the world?
Thanks so much. I work for the CG ICRISAT, and ICRISAT basically works for the semi-arid tropics. Those are very fragile ecosystems. And most of the time, we need to fit in crops and production systems that can sustain the environment. Already, as we work, other than sorghum, there are systems in Africa that already have some form of semi-perennial crops that exist. For example, in Ethiopia and Eritrea and other small places, we have the spate irrigation systems where there's no rainfall, probably 50 millimeters of rainfall. But the rainfall comes from the highlands and with all the acidity that it carries. And those systems are over 100 years old. They can plant sorghum on 50 millimeters, but most of the water is harvested and floods the fields. And they can harvest 3 crops. And the rainfall is just 50 millimeters. So the sorghum types that are produced there are basically semi-perennial. So the systems already exist. And of course, Africa is always food deficient. So we don't just need crop perenniality, but we also need ecosystem perenniality. Because as breeders, at times, we have tended to rely on our breeding genetic gain formula. Every breeder looks at that. Intensity of selection, genetic variance, that's additive genetic variance, accuracy, and then the cycle of selection. But in what systems are you selecting these varieties? Because eventually you end up with genetic gain that is misplaced because the ecosystem is not looked at. G by E by M. And if you ignore M, then that's gone. So there's potential because people are moving from the high potential areas because Africa is largely semi-arid. So they are moving from high potential areas to to marginal areas. And we need resilient systems to sustain that. And some of these crops that will fit in with the perenniality and disturbing the soil less will be more appropriate. Grazing systems, for instance, they are bare and people keep moving from place to place in search of grazing or pastures. But we have a diversity of perennial crops that could be looked at to be able to fit there to sustain not just food, but also livestock production systems. So there's potential for that. We just need to get the right champions, the right products to be able to convince the system that this works.
We have a couple Americans here on the panel, a couple folks from the U.S., Ebony Morrell from the Land Institute, crop protection ecologist, and Jake Youngers, an agronomist from the University of Minnesota. And I'm curious to ask the two of you, what challenges do you see with moving into more perennial cropping systems, and what are some of your ideas about ways to overcome those challenges? So maybe I'll start with Ebony, since challenges is kind of in your job description.
Well, thank you. So I would say that certainly the challenge of adoption in the face of the commercial clout that many of our annuals currently have. It's going to be extremely challenging to break into that market. We've certainly already started to break into that market, and I think at this point, being more of a novelty and being a fairly minor player, we're no threat at all. As the push comes, though, to increase the land area, though, I think there could be some pushback, certainly in certain areas of the country where corn and soybeans are still highly profitable to the farmers. I think the ways to address that, though, we're certainly thinking about those already. It's good that we have a commercialization manager on board, and I'm very thankful that we have the Ecospheric Studies program to sort of look at the social, take the social view and the view from the viewpoint of the farmers who are actually growing the crop. I think, just as the Land Institute itself was a grassroots organization, the way that we're going to get support is not by starting from the top and going down, but by starting from the bottom and going up. So, appealing to individuals at the grower level, at the consumer level, of the ecological benefits, of the economic benefits of our perennial grains, and being able to show growers on paper, that by growing perennial grains, there are tangible environmental benefits that directly also economically benefit their farming system, is what will at least begin to convince some who may not have been able to have been convinced, simply from the, sentimental point of view that this is the right thing to do.
And Jake, what do you think about challenges and opportunities to overcome them?
I'm thinking of two. First, I want to build off of what Ebony said with markets. I think that's definitely a challenge, and not just breaking into markets, but in the case of Kernza, we have to develop a new market. And then quantifying these environmental benefits that come from Kernza, like the water quality benefits and carbon sequestration, and then marketing those benefits and putting kind of an economic value on it if we can. So that's one challenge. Another challenge is agronomics. If you walk up to a farmer and ask she or he to grow a perennial grain crop, they'll say, well, where do you start with that? This is a brand new system for most farmers. So developing the agronomic recommendations, the plan to grow a brand new crop like this, and then also distributing that information to the farmers, identifying what farmers want to grow this, that are interested, that have the capacity to do it, and then disseminating that new information to them is also a challenge.
So I have lots of other questions for these folks, but I suspect you do too. We have a little less than 20 minutes, and let's go ahead and wrap Lee and Feng-Yi into this too. So what questions do you have for these folks and for Lee and Feng-Yi? And if we have a little lull, I have plenty of others in mind, but let's give you a shot to ask these folks some questions. So I think we have a roving mic here, and we can share this one, Lee and Feng-Yi, if you want to come up if there are questions for you.
Yeah, maybe I would like to start with Lee and Feng-Yi, because a lot of investment have been made for developing annual sow crops. Lot of work, and now there's a big trend in Europe to talk about diversification, not only in time as rotation, but also as diversification in space, what we call intercrops or polyculture. And my question to the two of you is, how do we develop the right varieties to go into polycultures or intercrop? I'm not sure I saw much in either of the two presentations you gave about how to develop these cultivars which are fitted into a polyculture, because this is our overall vision working in this. Is it the same cultivars which goes well for a sow crop of Kernza and a Kernza intercrop with a legume? I'm not sure, as I listen to breeders when we are in annual crops, and I would like to hear your comments on that and how you are working on this issue.
Yeah, I kind of have two things to say about selection in polyculture or even intercrop. One is that we know that selection in the right system matters, and so that it's important. We also know that it's difficult, and that it introduces a whole new realm of interactions that we don't know how to deal with. So it's an additional challenge, and maybe the third point is, as Jake mentioned, we don't have the system yet. So when you're trying to breed for the system that doesn't exist, that's even harder. So there has to be a sort of iterative back and forth, hopefully over time. The question is kind of where we are with breeding Kernza right now. We have so far to go on the domestication side that we haven't yet lost the diversity that would be useful in some other systems. So one of the problems that you might see with a highly refined annual grain crop is that it's pretty honed to a specific system, and you've lost a lot of that genetic diversity. We still have enormous diversity, where diversity is the plant breeder's friend, because that's part of how you make progress, but it's also what we have to get rid of to get down to something better. And so right now we're way on the side of lots of diversity. So this plant can still fit into lots of systems. We haven't thrown out any possibilities probably yet. You can always go back, but we know that we need to get things like absolutely solve shatter resistance. We absolutely have to have some, if there's a case of a crop you're developing with disease resistance, or seed size has to be bigger. And it doesn't matter which system you put the plant in, big seed or small seed is kind of comes out the same so we're looking for these major domestication phenotypes that don't really matter that much about what system they're in. So we're currently kind of on this side of does the system matter that much? And then eventually when you start fine-tuning, boy, I hope to be there someday soon where it really matters. But right now, we're just on the side of taking this crop from wild to useful. And then the next question is useful where and useful how. Vinny?
So it's more important for us also. We try different model for this intercrops with perennial rice, with other crops. And actually we are waiting for Dr. Brand for his perennial legume successful. But before that, we try intercrops with the faba bean, is a kind of the bean. And it also is more measured crops in this region. And usually in the double season, tropical region, this is a 2 season for rice per year for rice production. Is no problem for that. But for temperature regional, and just 1 season, 1 year. So in the winter, usually this farmer planting the canola, faba bean, what else? Wheat. So we use the faba bean, canola, and the other vegetable, as you know, in the space, big space, we into crops is some vegetable. So different models we tried. Actually, if some other perennial crops is successful, so is perennial rice intercrops as perennial crops should be good.
And Liz, just to build on that, I mean, I think the point that we need to sort of break the mould of how we think of sort of cultivar development, and I mean, obviously from what Lee said, the first release of the first Kernza cultivar is not the end game. It's kind of just the beginning, and I think what the whole meeting has been sort of heading towards, not just about the agronomy of perennial agriculture, but the whole perennial thinking, is that we need a more localised approach. We're not expecting the Land Institute to deliver, cultivars of Kernza to Australia and elsewhere, although they're obviously a pivotal part of of getting this going. But ultimately, I think what we're aiming towards is a more localised approach to cultivar development, which can fit a million different niches, and as the farming systems develop, the niches just grow more and more, and it's going to be an ongoing job.
If I could briefly add something to that as well, this is really another G by E question, right? Because there's certainly the genetic side of being able to breed varieties that will grow well with one another, but then there's also the environmental factor or the agronomic factor of how wide do you space your rows, when do you plant them, and which species partner best with each other in different parts of the world. So, that's definitely a question that, can be partly addressed by breeding, but, can also be addressed by, other factors.
The opening of that door just reminded me that I neglected one of my duties here as moderator, which was to let you all know that there's now another meeting happening on the other side of that door. So should you need to leave this room, we're going to leave through those doors. So brief break in the action there. Another question? Yes, the microphone's over here.
So I wanted to follow up on what Eric said about the need of the development of the system and what systems we have, and tie that with the use of livestock in the perennial grain systems. We are doing that with Kernza, but where do you see the role of livestock in perennial rice and perennial sorghum systems, maybe in Africa and in Asia?
Thanks. That is an issue that is now very top of the agenda in the CG system under the national programs, because as we move into those semi-arid areas, not even the high potential area where those crops are, animal feed is becoming less and less. So some of these crops have value as either direct grazing or fodder or feed in terms of grain for commercial or animal feed production. But in the fragile systems, we need to tie up so that we have crop varieties that are resilient, that will give both grain yield, dual-purpose types, that will give both yield, grain yield and storage for livestock. And we're going further to look into also the quality of the fodder, not just the fodder per se. What's the quality of fodder in terms of digestibility, in vitro digestibility, and all that? So the perennial systems would be really handy for that, because rainfall is very little. And then at times it rains. Right now in Kenya, for instance, we expect rains in March. It starts raining in May and rains once a week. So imagine if you had a perennial crop, it will not have to establish afresh. It will simply take off and give you some biomass and give you some yield. So it's a combination of this. And even within those other systems also, we're looking at crop livestock conflicts among the people. If one part of the community could produce fodder that could be able to be sold to the other part that is livestock keeping that is not able to produce fodder, that is a balance within those fragile systems. But still, at the same time, what you are saying is, if we have those perennial crops, of course, in terms of returns to investment, that can give you both grain and fodder, not necessarily the non-grain grain legumes and grain cereals. We have opportunities in those areas because we have grasses that we know that originated for those fragile systems that are hardy but that have not been harnessed. And possibly there's need to go back there and see what we can harness from within the diversity that we have in the systems there to be able to develop a perennial system that is already adapted there. So opportunities are great because those systems will also help revamp or revitalize the ecosystem, because that's why you have the highest erosion. And then the livestock adds to that erosion. So it could lead also to controlled grazing or controlled management of the grazing system so that you're able to balance the ecosystem so that you have production and controlled livestock production. We had that before in the 1970s, where you had range blocks in the systems, in those semi-arid systems. We had controlled pasture establishment within those rangelands. We had watering points that blocks were established, but all those systems broke down. So it's time to revisit that so that we have a proper management of those environments, producing both livestock and the fodder for the animals.
Damian.
If I could go back to your question, I think that it's really good that the Lund Institute and this group is doing what they're doing with Kernza, with Silphium, with rice, and with sorghum. But there are many other potential, and Alison is working with one group, and the Lund Institute is also working with legumes. And going back to the local, there are many other opportunities of developing local or regional plants that could provide good products and could also provide different services. The problem there and the issue, and we have encountered that in our work, in our group, is that getting the funding to do what the Lund Institute is doing. We have explored many other plants, and very soon you get to a dead end because you need to do it at a larger scale, and it's not feasible. So I think that the examples are good, and there's a lot of opportunity to explore more germplasm around the world, but again with resources.
I think we have time for one more question.
Talking about challenges, I wonder who do you think should have the responsibility or are willing to, by themselves, to put in the money for the research to develop those perennials, and who will be interested in selling them? I imagine that the big international corporations are not so interested in producing or selling seeds that will not be used so often.
Who's going to pick that one up?
I don't know. Maybe we can direct the question to the breeding companies or seed companies.
I'll have a go at it. Because in perennial forages, what we see at the moment under the existing system is abject market failure that's getting worse. So I think, again, we need to break the mould again, and I think actually the more I'm sort of hearing at this meeting, the more it becomes back to the responsibility of the individuals and at the more local scale to actually take it on. You don't have to go back far in history to see that it was not the big seed companies that developed the early cultivars and that developed the systems that we're using now. It was, often slightly eccentric farmers or, groups of farmers who, saw a plant that they liked and were interested in it and developed it and wrote letters to people on the other side of the world who'd worked with it. And, so I don't think the answer is in the big companies, and I think we will all be led to disappointment if we rely on that. I think we've got to take responsibility at a more local scale.
In terms of funding, us as researchers, especially in the United States, we have to get creative on where we're going to find funding. So a lot of the federal support for agriculture is directed towards our big crops. And there are ways we can get some of those resources to study some of these new alternative crops, but we also need to look elsewhere, look to some of the potential end users. Maybe we'll get some buy-in from them, some other partners in the supply chain, foundations. So it's really going to take building a portfolio of different grants and resources to keep the research going.
Yeah, Eric and then Anna.
I think there are opportunities that already exist. So we need to start from what is known before we even explore other species that are not in the domain in production yet. There are crops that are perennial. Within the crop species, some varieties are perennial. But some research systems, when they took them up, they put them off because of this quick yield issue of trying to get yield within 2, 3, 4 months, because you want food. I'll give you an example of pigeon pea, which is a nectarous crop. The traditional systems in East Africa had perennial pigeon pea, which still exist in dots here and there. But the researchers came and said, no, they want quick maturing varieties. So that has been forgotten. So the beginning would be what we know, from where we know, to build on to go to what we don't know. And today, as we speak, there is an effort to reorganize the thinking in the CG system with the donors like the BMGF. So this would be an opportunity for the voice of the perennial team to be heard if we had the right forum. So possibly that's the beginning before we even go to national systems.
While
Anna?
that is true in Africa, I don't think it's as true in South America, except for some particular areas, some parts of Brazil, some part of Peru and Bolivia. We don't have that long history, and we don't have the history of cultivation. And if I remember the first talk today, we are part of that, at least Argentina and southern Brazil are part of the same wheat invasion that was seen in the US. So we don't have the luxury that you have to have those old perennial crops that have been forgotten but can be recovered. We don't have them. So we need to start de novo in our place at least.
Anna, closing words here for our panel.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask a question to Lee. Yeah. So because I thought it was interesting. I mean, we need to increase the yield, of course. And you said that maybe in 50 years we can reach the seed yield in Kernza that we have in winter wheat. Did I? Yeah.
That seed size. That was.
Seed size. Okay. So then, my question is then: do you? I mean, how far do you think we can push this, the phenotypes, the traits in these wild perennials? Because we are often talking about the trade-off between perennial and their growth habit, and I think, I think this is an important perspective also. So, a question to you and other breeders.
Yeah, we don't think there's any theoretical limitation that states that our perennial grains must yield less than comparable annuals. We think they can yield probably as much, and it's probably going to be case specific. I mean, do we not grow wheat because it doesn't yield as much as maize? So there's lots of reasons to grow crops that are apart from yield alone, and so just making broad generalizations maybe isn't adequate, but we don't think that there's something inherently limiting about perennials because of, it's been talked about here already, but because of access to resources that may be slipping through our annual system. So if we can access more water, more fertility, and more sunlight, we see no reason why we can't make just as much or more grain. That's just a matter of allocation at that point. If we look at our most productive systems globally, they tend to be perennial dominated. If we just look at biomass produced, especially efficiently, and what grain breeding has done really well is allocate vegetative structures into more reproductive human edible structures. So that shift is one that we think as plant breeders is doable. We're not making up something from nothing. We're just reallocating. It doesn't mean that it's instantaneous or quick. You're really restructuring that plant's sort of life program. It goes beyond a small change, so it might take some decades to make that shift. In cases of where it's easier is a case of rice, where it's already almost a perennial. We have retuning rice crops, so making that just a little more robust is not going to be as difficult. We take something that's very annualized, it's going to be more of a challenge. And domestication is going to be variable how long it takes. And I think almost any wild plant can be probably domesticated and made useful for humans. It's a matter of how much money and how much time it's going to take. And so we're looking for the ones that are the easy ones. And so we're the ones that we can bring into usefulness with reasonable speed and reasonable cost.
All right, we're at our time, so let's thank our panel.